Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience for whom we are most grateful. Viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can also access our podcast at thefederalnewswire.com. My guest today is Isaac Stonefish, CEO and founder of Strategy Risks, a data research company that helps firms and regulators understand and reduce alternative forms of risk, including those involving China. Isaac lived in China for 7 years, speaks fluent Mandarin, and has visited every Chinese province, special autonomous region, and municipality. He's the author of America Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. He's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Truman National Security Project fellow, an on-air contributor to CBS News, a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, a columnist on China Risk at Barron's, and an adjunct professor at New York University's Center for Global Affairs. Isaac is a busy man. Today, we're going to be discussing Isaac's expose on American political and business leaders' deep ties to China, a network of people who believe that they are doing the right thing at a profound and often hidden cost to U.S. interests. America Second exposes a deep network of Beijing's influence in America, but quietly over the years through prominent figures like former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright, Disney chairman Bob Iger, and members of the Bush family. And it shows how to fight that influence without being paranoid, xenophobic, or racist. This is an authoritative and important story of corruption and good intentions gone wrong, with serious implications not only for the future of the United States, but for the world. But Isaac, that was a mouthful of an introduction, but I wanted to hit it because I've wanted to have this conversation for some time because of the interesting topic and your background. But with that, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
Well, let's start, as I warned in the pre-show, and we do for every one of our guests. We like going back to where it all started, get a sense of some of the formative things that happened in your life that kind of made you into the thinker that you are and how you ended up in the profession you're in now. So the usual question of, when you were in third grade and your teacher said, what did you want to be when you grow up? Did you say, I want to have a risk management firm and write a book about China?
Gosh, I was a pretty insufferable third grader. I think I said president or a philosopher, Supreme Court justice, something like that.
You hit the philosopher thing.
Yes. Yeah. So some links there, but it really was for me. I grew up in Syracuse, lovely family, but I wanted to get as far away as possible. It's upstate New York, but when people ask me where I'm from, I feel like I should say Ohio. It's much more of that vibe than a New York vibe. So I wanted to get as far away as possible. When I was a junior in high school, I had some options to go to summer travel programs, and I was choosing between Senegal, Bolivia, and China, Western China, specifically Xinjiang. And the reason I chose China was because China was bigger. And I just thought, because China is bigger, I won't get bored there.
Uh-huh. Well, I love it because so many people, myself included to a degree, who've ended up being identified with this policy area really had random entrances into the field. So before you did all that, did you have any language prep at all, or did you just sort of go in, and what was that like?
I went in with a high school tour group called Where There Be Dragons and a Lonely Planet language guide. And I was very proud of myself to be able to very strugglingly order food, to have some basic conversations. But I went that summer, went the summer after. I took 2 years of Mandarin in college, and then I did a summer program in Beijing summer after my sophomore year, and I could not get cab drivers to understand me. So it was really only living there that I was able to speak and communicate. And there's no replacement for that. And it's sad that I cannot encourage folks to go back and live there now because the political climate is so radically different.
Yeah. Well, take us back in time. So you went to China's far west to Xinjiang. What was sort of the date range for that, and what was it like at that time? Your sort of first impressions.
We're stumbling out of a plane in Kashgar in 2001, and it being so jarring because it just did not correspond with the reality that I was used to. It was the first real international trip I had been. I'd been to Canada, I'd been to Israel, but those felt a lot more familiar. This just
Mhm.
felt radically different, and it took me a long time to calibrate in my head on where that was. And we spent most of the summer driving around rural Xinjiang in 2001. My former boss of mine at Newsweek went to Tibet in the late 70s, and she said it felt medieval. Xinjiang in 2001 wasn't quite medieval, but it wasn't terribly far from this abject, almost historic poverty that China had in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Well, I had a time when I tried to get out there, and the government was kind enough to find a way for me to get to Xining in Qinghai province, but it just wasn't convenient to get a connecting flight to either Lhasa or Urumqi. It just wasn't going to work out. So sorry. And everything that I needed to know conveniently was available to me in Xining. So they told me. But I always was interested in China's far west, in part because I think it reminds those that look with fresh eyes, this ain't China. What was your kind of what did you see besides the poverty, just in terms of the sort of culture of the landscape? It wouldn't shock me that you're not going to get pure Mandarin capabilities out in that neck of the woods.
I spent the next summer in Tibet, and that was really a transformative experience. I'd say probably more so than Xinjiang, because in this country, especially back then, there was a lot of magical thinking about Tibet being this beautiful Orientalist landscape, this the
Yeah.
Shangri-La. Tibet in 2002 was a very violent place. Our Tibetan guide bragged about the Chinese soldiers that he'd killed. There was a lot of visceral antipathy for the Han there. And I think that helped with my journey both into China and out of China, and being able to be skeptical about these received narratives, both about Xinjiang and Tibet, but also about the country as a whole. I think we forget often Xinjiang literally means new borderlands.
Yeah.
Sure, New York, but very different context. And it's not the new borderlands, new frontier. Xinjiang is relatively new into the Chinese motherland, and there's a lot of people who make very good cases about why that should not be part of China.
So you had these initial kind of feet in the dipping into the water experiences in two of the, I would say, most controversial parts of the People's Republic of China. And yet you made it back to live for a stretch of years. Surely the government might have suspected that you had a devious mind for having gone out to those areas. So talk a little bit about what kind of settled you in for that solid stretch, and set the scene for what date ranges those were, and how that was part of your evolution into what you saw, you knew, and getting deeper into being a China expert.
In 2006, I was interning at a publishing house my senior year of college, and I made the strategic decision to speak to someone in Chinese so my boss could overhear. And he said, "Oh, you speak Chinese. We want to open a branch in Beijing," because this was the era of we can make this work with China. So I got sent out there to open a literary agency and to look for Chinese authors, the Chinese Murakami. I don't know if that exists, and I certainly didn't find him. But that was my first 2-year experience in Beijing, and it was a much more optimistic time. It was right before the Olympics. It was a sense that China is standing up, that China is getting the wealth that it deserves, and it didn't feel politically mild. Certainly, comparing the leader at the time, Hu Jintao, to Xi Jinping, it felt like a much more open period. But one didn't know the direction it was going in. It felt like it was going to kept getting more open, and perhaps people more sophisticated than I saw the seeds of the clampdown under Xi, but I certainly didn't. I thought it was just going to keep going in that direction.
That's also a pretty common observation among a lot of our China Desk guests, of people who had a distinct experience that is pre Xi Jinping versus post Xi Jinping. And it's one of those things where history is going to have to be a guide about coincidence or causation. I think all of us will have a bit of a bias having lived through some of this. But talk now about how did you go from that experience to coming to write this book? Because the book, America Second, is looking at what I would call some of the malign influences of Americans in the U.S.-China relationship. I think it shouldn't come as a shock to most that we assume there are malign influences in the Chinese Communist Party, but how they use some of these very high-profile Americans is an important case study about cognitive warfare and influence operations, something that's talked about a bit more now, but it all began with the Friends of China crowd. But from what I take on our conversation so far, up until this Olympics period and thereabouts, you hadn't really formed a strong opinion about that at that stage, had you?
I hadn't. And I remember some early conversations where people would say to me, oh, China's doing wonderful things to the farmers. And they'd mostly be old white men. And I'd say, have you lived there? Have you gone and talked to these people? Have you gotten a real reflection? Because I think a lot of Chinese people in the initial conversation will say, oh, no, I don't talk politics. And then as you get to know them, you realize that there's a wide variety of views. And so what happened for me is left China in December 2011, moved to the States, worked at Foreign Policy magazine. And I was so surprised at the way that American elites would talk about China because they would keep repeating the same propaganda. And it was so different from the way that Chinese people talked about China, which was quite varied. And there was this sense, and again, it's this Orientalist claptrap about 1.4 billion people thinking the same way, which doesn't exist, or China being just a agglomeration of brainless automatons. And so the phrases that really stuck with me were China has 5,000 years of history. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and China doesn't want war. And all of these phrases are propaganda. And it's not about the veracity of propaganda. It's the fact that it's propaganda. And so, I think back to someone in, say, 1910 saying, hey, I really believe in socialism. And I believe in socialism on a national level. And therefore, I'm a national socialist. Okay, great. You say that in 1910. Fantastic. You say that at any point after the 1930s, you're a Nazi. That's what National Socialism is. And so you can't use phrases divorced from their historic context. I think we saw that with the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter protest as well. If you're a humanist, you can say all lives matter. But if you're saying all lives matter, you're making a political statement, whether the words in the political statement have the resonance you want them to or not. And so people would say China has 5,000 years of history. Well, sure, so does Syria. And the implication of that was the party is the apogee of that 5,000 years of history, as opposed to the party is 1.8% of China's history. And like every dynasty and government that preceded it in China will someday fall. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China has also put hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And the Communist Party is, I would argue, less responsible for the success and more for the failure. And then China doesn't want war is more of a, okay, sure. And you know that because, and that's also very much not how wars happen. There's a lot more of that has since unfolded, but it's one of my favorite hobby horses to get on. It's very frustrating to me. And people have stopped using those phrases. And I think the decline and untimely death of Kissinger has also caused some of that to recede. But it used to be the way people talked about China, and it was deeply, deeply frustrating.
Absolutely. Well, you have three favorite pet rocks of mine in those topics. And I do want to pivot to talk about Kissinger and start talking about your work on the America Second book. But of these, my favorite is the 5,000 Years of History. Number one, there's a huge portion of that is mythology. Number two, the Communist Party literally conducted a murderous revolution against everything that came before it. And part of the core argument of that campaign was its fight against the olds, which were the animating and defining versions of those dynasties. And since we have this, I think, fiction of one China today, Most of that 5,000 years, you had territory that expanded and contracted, almost all concentrated around the eastern portion of today's territory. And you had classic works that had titles that were conspicuously like the Three Kingdoms, which certainly is not a one China theme throughout all that history. So fun stuff to be had by all, but most of it just isn't true. So making policy based on untruths sure seems like the house built upon sand fable to me, but I digress.
There's a Chinese joke, it's my mom is 我妈是湖南的，我爸是东北的，我是混血. So it's, my mom is from Hunan, my dad's from the Northeast, and so I'm of two different races. Yes. So there is a lot of regional diversity in China that the party likes to forget and that people like to not talk about when they pretend that this is such a bland monoculture.
Well, that's also not a small theme. The journey of the human experience that is just around concepts of identity, how people choose to identify themselves. I'm sure that you lived this experience too, but anyone that spent any meaningful time in China, the first impulse when someone asks, where are you from, or what in Chinese, what kind of person are you, kind of thing, their first impulse is to say the city or region they come from. It's not to say I'm a Chinese person.
Yeah,
it's that is an alien, borderline European way of thinking that went in, and the Communist Party has made good use of it. But I think almost 10 times out of 10, if you went down the streets of Shanghai or Guangzhou, you would get I'm Shanghainese or I'm a Guangdongren as what people would say. And that's just reality, that China was a bunch of these atomized areas with, if anyone who's tried to study those dialects, in some cases, much more complex languages than Mandarin. And they had histories, cultures, all that stuff. Yeah, to those of us far away, it sort of seems similar. But, how similar or different versus people in the Koreas, people in Japan, people in Southeast Asia. And that's not, it's just, anyway, it's one of those things that I've always been blown away that Chinese people will instinctively identify with their locality, not the nation.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
So, if the people of Taiwan have to suffer under Chinese Taipei, maybe we should impose Chinese Beijing or Chinese Shanghai or Chinese Guangdong on folks from China.
Well, actually, from a very concrete policy perspective, it's something I've been saying for a very long time. The U.S. has got to stop calling it the South China Sea.
Oh, why? Amen. Amen. I know. And it's only in English. In Chinese, they don't do it.
Yes, that's the main. They call it the South Sea in Chinese. Yeah. They don't even call it South China Sea, and so we're giving them the sea in English when we're not doing it when they're not doing it in Chinese. And the words matter so much, and the labeling matters so much, and propaganda and psychological warfare is such a big part of Beijing's warfighting strategy. And it's a very easy thing to counter. I get worried. We're a little off topic here, but I get worried on all of the talk about defense spending and so much less talk about, hey, there's so many cheaper ways to counter Beijing.
Well, that's not off topic at all, because I think that's kind of where we want to end up after we are blessed with the soothing rays of wisdom from your work in your book. So you mentioned something about cognitive warfare and propaganda. So let's talk about Henry Kissinger and some other folks in the American pantheon of U.S.-China relations. But before we get into the meat of the book, talk about how you arrived at sort of this target set. And because this, you I assume did some comparative research, and probably your publisher required comparative research before running with the topic. But there aren't that many works in English that dive into these particular special interests as the theme. So correct me or give a little bit of perspective of how you arrived there and how this is a corrective for a field.
I got fascinated by conflicts of interests, corruption, and self-censorship. And at a later point in this conversation, I want to make sure to talk about some of my own conflicts of interest and some of the own areas that I self-censor. And I got so frustrated being in DC and hearing people talk publicly about China or Turkey or Saudi Arabia as former government officials and pretending that they weren't consulting. And Kissinger, since he started Kissinger Associates in 1982, was a businessman masquerading as a diplomat. And so he would go and he would make these grand pronouncements and he would pretend that he was some independent thinker. Well, he was a businessman. And perhaps there's nothing wrong with being a businessman, but what really rankled me was just his inability and others' inability to treat him as a businessman and the power and influence that he had over foreign policy. I'd argue he's the most influential foreign policy statesman of the 20th century and still, I think, of the 21st. And people just refused to tackle the massive, massive conflicts of interest he had, especially with China.
Well, this, personally, and witnessing it with other folks, if it involved anyone with any other area, say, for instance, Taiwan or Israel, there was always just copious combing over of where did this money come from and who are you representing? And you would almost get marginalized, even if you were giving your own views founded on years of experience that had nothing to do with contributions from anywhere. It was just one of the sort of tools in the toolkit for the pro-China engagement crowd to try to undermine anyone who was critical or skeptical. And yet there was a do not touch kind of unspoken rule for the Mandarins among Americans that were talking about this stuff. So definitely I lived a lot of this. And what was remarkable to me is in today's partisan world and maybe hyper-partisan world, this deeply affected both parties. And if you think back to the 1970s, we had the country ravaged by disagreement over the Vietnam War, an impeachment and resignation for, going to be impeached president and a resignation of a president. The Carter election, you would have thought that there wouldn't be this degree of continuity from Kissinger and into Brzezinski, the Nixon to Carter, but frankly, and beyond. So you had your target set. You got sick of seeing this kind of stuff. How'd you end up writing the book, and sort of what was the sort of arc of the work and the message that you were honing into in America Second?
The message was we can do this better, and that we have to name names, and the cone of silence in DC around foreign policy elite had to be broken. I'm certainly not the only one who's done this. A lot of other people have done great work on this. Perhaps the most disappointing to me was Madeleine Albright, who had long positioned herself as an icon of democracy, wrote a book on fascism, talked about how North Korea was truly a fascist state. Great, reasonable. How Russia might be fascist. Okay, great. Turkey, I think she said, might be fascist. Okay, interesting. America under Trump might be fascist. Ooh, interesting, provocative. You're making a big point here. China, developing very rapidly. And so the idea that someone who, after leaving office as first female Secretary of State, again, icon of democracy, starts a consulting company that does a lot of work in China, writes a book criticizing a lot of people for being fascist, some deservedly, some debatedly, but just refuses to tackle the issue of whether or not China is fascist, to me is just a glaring, glaring omission and an offensive slap in the face of truth. And so that was very disappointing to me. And there's a lot of other examples on that. And I don't, when one calls people out, I am not, an arbiter of cleanliness when it comes to these things. The Judeo-Christian or more Christian, the sort of, what is it? He without sin casts the first stone. I have made conflicts. I've made wrong decisions when it comes to these things. I run a consulting and data business now. We take money from companies. It changes the way that I speak publicly. I'm not independent. I live in the DC ecosystem in a way, and that changes who I criticize publicly. So I don't want to pretend that, I have some God-given right to criticism or independence. I'm part of this mess too. At the same time, I'd like people to be a lot more explicit about their conflicts and about who they're working with and how it changes their views. And sometimes when you write an op-ed, they want you to say, oh, visiting fellow at this think tank, and not put your business. I always want to put the business. Yes, great, I'm marketing the business, but also I don't want people to think that I don't run a business, because that changes the way that I think and I act. And I think that's a very fundamental issue of importance.
Well, transparency and accountability would be novel concepts in this kind of conversation, but sure does seem like a meaningful contribution. Like I say, I mean, everybody who has engaged in business with free and democratic countries gets these stones thrown at them, and it is conspicuously those who have engaged in business with the authoritarians that somehow that is frowned upon or pushed back against, and how dare you question their integrity and depth of thought. But you're clearly a very mean person who's tried to write an attack book on a few people. So how do you sort of redeem these bad qualities in yourself and reflect and give us basically the Paul Harvey rest of the story, which is, this isn't really about those individuals. It's about a system and an approach to policy that has an effect on the core interests of America and our allies. So, without presuming to know every element of your book and your thinking, talk a little bit about really, this is about how policy is made and influenced, with some recommendations about, as you say, we could do this better. One of those things being transparency and accountability. But talk a little bit about the broad policy arc that you're also talking about as you share these reveals that I assume got some attention to your book. And I want to talk about whether you got a little blowback at all from some of that. But talk about the policy part of it first.
So 4 periods of US-China history. Nixon, Kissinger go to China, counter the Soviet Union, enemy of my enemy is my friend. That lasts until roughly 89 with the fall of the Soviet Union, massacre of unarmed students on Tiananmen Square, and the sense that, we don't need China to counter against the Soviet Union because that's falling apart. And so the next idea was trade brings liberalization. And by bringing China into the family of nations, they will become more like us. That lasted until either 2001, 2005, depending on how you'd like to define that, and the long distraction of 9/11. And the next period, Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick, was the responsible stakeholder period. We can make China into a responsible stakeholder of the global system built to serve mostly US interests. Shockingly, Beijing didn't want that, because they didn't find that the global system served their interests. That period ended roughly 2016. I think it would have ended regardless of who had won in 2016. But 2016 or 2018, depending on how you want to define it, we're in this new period. And I don't think provocatively call it the pre-war period. This is a time of fervent, and this is a time when we're trying to figure out, can we as a country live with a China that could be more powerful than us? If not, what do we do about it? What are the costs? There's the sense of, if there's a deal with China, is that something that staves off a cataclysmic World War III, or is that a Neville Chamberlain peace in our time that just forestalls the inevitable? So it's a very, very dangerous and unpredictable time. And one of my frustrations with both DC, but especially the folks in the business world, is there's not nearly enough concrete conversations about what a war would look like. Because people think, if you're talking about war, it means you're pro-war. Mm-hmm. And I think that's such a silly framework. Just imagine someone talking about the pandemic in 2019 and saying, no, you're pro-pandemic. How dare you prepare for it? It's very silly. And so the question is, okay, there's a possibility that this can happen. I can't predict the future, but signs are pointing to this being a real possibility. And so from where you're sitting, how are you thinking about it, and what are you doing about it?
So these archetypes of the big personalities that had played a role, how do these sort of influence campaigns shake out as you go through this arc of basically feeding the rise of the People's Republic of China to, where might this be going? And we're not so sure which direction the fork in the road is going to take us to. Now we're talking about whether there might be a war, how to prevent the war, how to deter, survive, etc. What are the ways that you cover in the book for how these influence campaigns are played out?
Beijing's most powerful weapon for American friends is not money, it's ego. And Beijing gratifies ego like nowhere else in the world. And what Beijing is able to give former officials is this sense that you are at the pinnacle of power and only you can understand the greatness and the subtlety of the Chinese nation, and only you can save this relationship. And they're so phenomenal at that. And we've seen that throughout US China history, from Harvard professor Fairbank to Edgar Snow, all throughout Kissinger's life, throughout US presidents, Democratic and Republican. Trump, on going to the Forbidden City, said something like, "No one has ever been treated as good as I have in the history of China." So it works. It's very, very effective. And you think too of these former secretaries of state who fly into Mexico City or anywhere around the world and are treated like gods. It's so gratifying to be there and to see the city shut down to welcome you. But then you're a former secretary of state and you're flying commercial. Yeah, you're business class, but you're waiting in a long line. No one's respecting you. No one's treating you like you deserve. So Beijing was very good at bringing these people there and treating them like kings. And that is very, very effective.
Well, I like you brought out some of the trappings because that does play out in real life. They will send you into a VIP reception area. You don't go through normal immigration processes. They will block off Beijing's infamous traffic and have sirens, lights, the whole motorcade experience. Put you up in a better hotel than you deserve, and you get to sort of hang out in the posh and exclusive areas of political and business leadership. You go into the cavernous buildings with these giant rooms inside that'll have that horseshoe shape. And where do you go? You go to the center stage. It's all about you in this big spot. And so few people sort of catch on to the mind game and all of that. But I think you're right. I don't know that there are very many other places. There are a short list of places where sort of the ugly people prom that is DC can go and get treated like Hollywood stars. And this is definitely one of them. And they might even throw in, a fresh suitor that you didn't know you wanted or needed in your life is there to be your best friend or business partner or something else. Who knows?
There's a lot of that honey trapping that has come out with Russia and far less of it, which has come out with China. It's an old example, but something I cite in my book is Neil Bush, brother of one president and son of another, who on going to hotel rooms in Hong Kong would be surprised to see prostitutes sent to his door. And it came out in his divorce deposition. And, feel bad talking about something so tawdry, but it's such an effective tool of influence. And back when I was a reporter, you just hear all these stories about this happening and just think, this is a very potent piece of this as well.
Well, there's the tawdry oldest profession, as they may say, but there is the financial version of this, of people making big business with you that is not that different of a relationship in my estimation. So this is I assume where a lot of your research went into. Okay, so we have these high-level officials. They get treated like royalty, but they're also sort of the gatekeeper, the bridge, the ambassador for bringing big deals, big transactions together. And on that, they can build these practices where people who are in the revolving door can come out, make a bit of coin, You help elevate their profile in media or other commentary or an academic affiliation. Go to a famous Ivy League policy institute for a time as they are simultaneously doing this business. And then they can go back and be an undersecretary of who's-a-whatsy, and on the cycle will go. So am I making stuff up, or is this the kind of stuff that you were finding as you dug into it?
This is the way it went. And so Kissinger, for example, would go and have meetings with Xi Jinping, and they would have these grand policy conversations. And then at the end, he'd say, oh, by the way, it's a shame what's happening to, say, Coca-Cola or Boeing or whoever was paying them at the time, and Rio Tinto. He had a multi-million-dollar deal with Rio Tinto. And the idea was, okay, so this is, I'm paying you all of this for this 10-second passing of information to Xi Jinping. I think the other thing about this grand structure is that the people doing this could convince themselves that they were patriots. Mm-hmm. They were bringing US-China closer together, which is good for China and good for America. And so they could do this and feel good about themselves. It's really hard to turn someone. It's much easier to convince them that they're acting in their and their country's best interest when they're really not.
I think that's an underreported part of the conversation on these influence operations, and sort of how the sort of key players in DC, New York, elsewhere have framed things up over the years. But as we get into sort of the now and kind of the conversation that I think has crossed different party lines and geographies, we have talk about CCP acquisition of ag land conspicuously near sensitive places, fake police stations that can pop up in different places, affinity organizations that are supposed to look at ethnicity and culture, but there's more to it than meets the eye. We have CCP activists, People's Republic of China nationals that end up in employment with high-profile Americans in corporate research and political realms. So your book and that work is looking at the arc of some of these household names that became a part of this and certainly shaped the broad direction the U.S.-China relationship was going and how it was defended, and sort of the narrative that was meant to sort of protect the direction that was going. But today, we've got kind of a counter swing in that pendulum. And so let's spend a little bit of time of the findings in your book and how it feeds into how we can do better. What are some of the ways the organism that is the American experiment, the broad public, is correcting and insulating against some of this now?
I turned in my book summer of 2020, and it came out February 2022. COVID, goes without saying, was such a radical shift in U.S. perception of China. And there was a lot of very deep-seated frustration at what Beijing did, especially in the early days of the pandemic. And I think for where we've been over the last couple of years, but especially where we are now, it really is about working, both with and against U.S. businesses and U.S. institutions so that they are not too heavily exposed to China and to the Chinese Communist Party. And there's real national security implications, there's real ethical implications, but more importantly for the businesses, there's real business implications. It does not make the financial sense that it made before. And companies need to do a much better job of pricing out their China risk and the externalities that they are covering and also fostering, because it is very possible new types of regulation come in that make them pay for those. And what we tell our clients is that this is probably going to be a big era of deregulation, except when it relates to China. And very fully expecting much more to come down the pike that reduces the ability of US businesses to really engage with China. I think the other piece too is people understand that to succeed, businesses understand that this administration, having close ties with this administration, is a lot more important than it's been in past administrations because of the way that Trump wields power. And so right now, and Trump does go back and forth on this, he is more unpredictable than, say, Senator Rubio or Hegseth or other folks on where they are in China, but he is more hawkish than not. And so understanding that you don't want to get under the microscope for your China exposure. And Beijing doesn't like it either. I think that's the other piece that often gets forgotten, is that when companies in the United States, like say Disney several years ago, get a lot of criticism for their China exposure, Beijing finds that distasteful and usually punishes the companies domestically.
Yeah, so I think part of the antidote serum that you have recommended, I will just define as transparency and accountability. And I want you to talk a little bit about that, because transparency and accountability are not what the People's Republic of China excel at. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. But the landing spot for this is a question we've had for almost every guest. And that is, what role do you think the concept of reciprocity should play in how Americans in leadership or otherwise think about and shape the American engagement with the People's Republic of China? So first, transparency and accountability and the role that plays in the realities. You lived in China and you've done due diligence on these kinds of things to talk about what transparency and accountability look like. And then let's hit a wrap on how relevant and how does a concept of reciprocity rightfully fit into our thinking on this?
The biggest problems often have the simplest solutions. So Doge, for example, I have problems with Elon Musk, but I do applaud the effort to try to slash the federal budget. The federal budget is too large. What do? We cut it. Okay, great. How? Well, that's long and complicated, but the solution is to cut the budget. And same thing with China exposure. The solution is transparency. How do you push for US companies to be more transparent, or for regulators to push for more transparency, or for consumers to ask where their goods are coming from? And so I don't think Scope 3, which is a potential SEC requirement about greenhouse gas emissions, is going to pass in this administration. But the idea there was most manufacturing, or a very large part of manufacturing, comes from China. And so if you have to disclose your carbon footprint, a lot of that's going to require you to disclose how much you're manufacturing from in China, which is embarrassing. This is going to draw a lot of attention to you that it doesn't want. And I do applaud the role that Congress has played, and this has been very bipartisan, in shining the light on some of these excesses with US companies. Reciprocity, throw it out. Terrible idea when it comes to China, because if we calculate US policy towards China as reciprocity as a success marker, it's been an abject failure. We don't want to act like Beijing acts. It doesn't make any sense, and it's a silly framework, I would say. I feel very strongly about that. It's, you're only letting in a few of your journalists, so we're not going to let in Chinese journalists. Well, okay, then they'll hire Americans for Chinese broadcasting networks. Oh, you're not letting in American social media, so we're not going to let in Chinese social media. Well, the reason we're not letting in Chinese social media isn't because Meta can't succeed in China. It's because TikTok is dangerous. And most countries, or most important countries, have some sort of regulations restricting foreigners from owning key parts of the infrastructure defined broadly. And so I really just think it's frankly silly. I think one area where we do have to keep it is parity of meetings. People get confused by the Chinese system. And so someone will meet a governor, a US governor will meet a Chinese governor, when the governor is the lieutenant governor. The party secretary is the person with the power. And so when, say, the US Secretary of Defense meets with the Chinese Minister of Defense, it's insulting because he is a level below. The US Secretary of Defense should meet with one of the two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission. And that's the way it should be. And so I think there's also this fixation on dialogue, and we need to keep the conversation alive. Well, sure, dialogue sounds nice, and countries do talk to each other during wartime, but why are we making sacrifices so that China will come to the phone?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm part of the silly crowd that talks up reciprocity. And part of it is because I think it's somewhat consistent with where you've been going. If it's a useful measure to just try to get people to think again about what are we doing and why are we doing it, and then highlighting an area that needs change or adjustment. We're never going to have perfect tools in doing this, but pointing out disparities sometimes can reframe how people make assumptions and build foundations for what we're doing. And I'm okay if it gets the common man and woman involved into the conversation by saying, well, our social media doesn't get access to the Chinese people. Why should CCP-owned media have access to ours? The objective might not be to cut off. The objective is to say, well, there's something wrong that needs to be addressed. And if you can take it from there, I think that's net helpful. But we're not here to have a kumbaya about whether reciprocity is the way to go. I'm glad that you have a strong feeling about it. And I'm glad that we can still find a lot of common ground on where to go on this stuff.
Sorry, I was just going to say, also, you have served in government, and so you've actually dealt with these things on those basis. I've never been in government. And so I think there's a grounding in reality there that your views may have that mine don't on these things. I am very, very skeptical of the U.S.-China relationship today, and I will probably remain that way until there's a radical shift in the Communist Party.
Well, I think the skepticism is healthy. And one of the things that has fascinated me about your work, this book, and some of the things we've talked about is how we have lived in parallel universes and arrived at some similar observations and conclusions. Not a perfect overlap of the Venn diagram, but there's a lot of it there, which tells me there's probably a lot more people out there that have had those conversations. And one of the, I think, polluting side effects of what you have highlighted in your book is that not only did these people have prominent roles in government, not only did they do business that isn't properly disclosed or caveated, but they also influenced kind of the research, public policy organizations that were kind of the key discussion groups. And that people who might have had experiences like yours or mine or others, they don't have a seat at that table because our experience leads us to a conversation that doesn't fit the narrative on which those houses were built. And one of the blessings of whatever anyone wants to call this period of 2015 to the present day, I think it's a course correcting period if it's used right. And one of the areas of course correction might be this business model that you've highlighted. And I mean business both in policymaking and in business. So I congratulate your work, and I hope people will go and take in the book in whatever form it's available. But with that, Isaac, this is the time where I want you to be able to give a parting thought, but also tell people where to go to follow your commentary, your work, and otherwise engage the conversation further with you.
Thank you, Steve. I run a company called Strategy Risks. We quantify exposure to China. And so we rank companies on their China exposure and sell data and business intelligence that helps companies and regulators navigate these issues. I also, we started this conversation with my high school self, and I just think of my college self and high school self dying with, shame's not the right word, but dying with something about how much time I spend on LinkedIn. And I do post a lot on LinkedIn about some analysis. I do a lot of media hits. I'm a little bit more active on Twitter or X, as I guess it's called now, than I would like to be. But I do try to be open with my views and my thoughts and enjoy having these conversations.
Well, I think it's an important conversation to be had, and I appreciate you taking time to do it with us today. For our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and visit ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and thank you to Isaac Stonefish for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.